apartment was quiet, save for the faint creak of the wooden floorboards as Clara stepped inside. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden light filtering through the blinds. It was a small, forgotten space, a room she hadn't seen since childhood. The landlord had been clear. Nobody's lived here in years. Some say it's better that way. Clara had laughed it off then, brushing aside his hesitation as just another quirk of old properties. But now, standing in the doorway, she couldn't ignore the sense of heaviness in the air, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She set her suitcase down, the sound echoing unnaturally in the empty room. The place smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with something sharper like iron. Clara wrinkled her nose and began to explore. The furnishings were sparse, an old wooden chair, a small table, and a tarnished mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. It was just as she remembered, and yet something felt off. The silence was too complete, too still, like the room was waiting for something. It didn't feel like the room, as though the room no longer had one. Clara turned, her hand brushing the doorframe. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she wasn't sure it was real. Clara. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room. It was empty as it had always been, but now she wasn't so sure she was alone. Clara settled into the small apartment despite its unsettling atmosphere. The price was unbeatable, and she needed a quiet place to focus on her writing. After years of chaos and a failed engagement, the solitude felt necessary, a chance to start over. The landlord, Mr. Harrow, had seemed hesitant when she signed the lease. "This place has its quirks," he'd muttered, avoiding her gaze. She dismissed his words as an old man's superstition. Now, as she unpacked her belongings, she couldn't shake the memory of his warning. The apartment was part of an aging building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering oak trees that cast long, shifting shadows. Clara found the setting charming during the day, but as night fell, the charm gave way to an oppressive stillness. Her first few days passed quietly. She spent hours at her desk by the window, sipping tea and sketching outlines for her next novel. The story was meant to be a fresh start, a departure from the thrillers she had written in the past. But inspiration proved elusive. As she struggled with writer's block, the apartment began to reveal its secrets. Doors creaked open on their own, and faint tapping noises echoed through the walls. She chalked it up to the building's age and her overactive imagination. Then there were the voices. At first they were fleeting, a name whispered on the edge of hearing, indistinct murmurs in the dead of night. She told herself it was just the wind or a neighbor in the adjoining unit. But the building was nearly empty, and the whispers always seemed to come from within her apartment. One evening, Clara found an old notebook tucked behind the mirror. The cover was cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age. Inside were fragments of entries, written in a hurried, jagged hand. "The voices grow louder at night. They know my name. I don't know how much longer I can stay." Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. The entries became increasingly frantic, detailing dreams of dark figures and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Clara closed the notebook, her fingers trembling. She told herself it was someone's attempt at a horror story, a creative exercise left behind by a previous tenant. But the unease gnawed at her. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were clearer now, unmistakable. "Clara, you shouldn't have come back." She sat up, her breath hitching. The room was empty, yet the voice felt close, intimate. It carried a strange familiarity, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Her mind. The next morning, Clara confronted Mr. Harrow. "What happened in that apartment?" she demanded. He sighed, his weathered face lined with discomfort. "Some say the room remembers. that it holds on to those who leave too much of themselves behind. It's not a place for someone with unresolved pain, miss. Ooh, Clara laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. But as she returned to the apartment, her steps faltered. Deep down, she wondered if he was right. The days blurred into one another, but Clara couldn't shake the growing unease that clung to her like a shadow. The whispers became more persistent, their tones shifting from faint murmurs to unmistakable voices. They called her name, spoke in fragmented sentences, and sometimes they wept. She tried to ignore them, throwing herself into her writing, but each time she sat at her desk, the words refused to come. Instead, her gaze drifted to the mirror on the wall. It had become a fixation, as if something beyond the glass demanded her attention. One evening she decided to remove it, hoping to rid herself of its unsettling presence. As she pried the mirror from the wall, she uncovered something unexpected. A door. It was small, almost childlike in size, with a brass handle dulled by time. Her breath caught. She hadn't noticed any extra space on the floor plan, and there was no logical reason for a door to exist here. Curiosity warred with fear as she gripped the handle and gave it a gentle tug. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow passage, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp wood and something metallic. Trembling, Clara stepped inside, her footsteps echoing faintly. The passage led to a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves holding odd trinkets, old photographs, rusted keys, and cracked porcelain dolls. At the center of the room was a wooden chair, its surface worn smooth by time. On the chair sat another notebook, identical to the one she had found earlier. Clara approached cautiously, her fingers brushing the worn leather cover. The pages inside were filled with the same frantic handwriting, but these entries were different. She hears us. She's starting to remember. The room won't let her leave. Francesca poured the tea. Clara staggered back, the notebook slipping from her hands. The air grew colder, and the flickering bulb above dimmed until it barely glowed. Clara cried out in horror as she recognized the face before her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The room responded with silence, then a sudden sharp whisper right by her ear. "You know us, Clara." She fled back to the apartment, slamming the hidden door shut and dragging the mirror back into place. Her heart raced as she leaned against the wall, her mind spinning. The following nights were worse. The voices no longer waited for nightfall. They spoke to her in broad daylight. She began seeing movement in the corner of her eye, a flicker of a shadow, a ripple in the air. The worst came when she found the photograph. It was tucked inside her desk drawer, though she had never placed it there. The image was of a family, a mother, father, and a little girl with bright eyes and dark curls. The girl was her, but the faces of the parents were obscured, blurred, as though the photograph had been smudged. A single word was scrawled across the back. "Remember." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Memories she had long buried began to resurface. A time when she had lived in this very apartment as a child, before her parents had abruptly moved. She had always thought it was due to her father's job, but now she wasn't so sure. As the voices grew louder, Clara realized they weren't just calling to her, they were trying to show her something. The empty room wasn't empty at all. It held echoes of the past, fragments of a story she had been too young to understand. But why now? And what did the room want her to see? The whispers reached a crescendo one stormy night, their voices layering into a chaotic symphony that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Clara sat in the center of the apartment, her knees drawn to her chest, her breathing shallow. After a few minutes, "Enough!" she screamed. her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The room fell silent, an oppressive stillness settling over her like a heavy blanket. Then, slowly, the mirror began to vibrate, its surface rippling as though it were water. Clara watched, frozen, as her reflection twisted into something unrecognizable, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes that stared back at her. "Oh, you left us," the figure whispered, its voice layered with anguish and accusation. Clara stumbled to her feet, shaking her head. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The hidden door behind the mirror creaked open, revealing the narrow passage once more. This time, however, a dim glow emanated from within, pulsing like a heartbeat. Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run, but something deeper, a need to know the truth, compelled her forward. As she got closer, the muddle grew larger and quickly reached the level of her eyes, competing with the light from the mirror flowing past. The circular room was different now. The shelves were empty, and the chair at the center was occupied. A woman sat there, her features eerily familiar, though aged and worn. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale, and her expression was a mix of sorrow and desperation. "Mom?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "You forgot us, Clara. You buried what happened here, but the room didn't." Clara's knees buckled, memories flooding back in a painful torrent. She was 6 years old again, hiding under the bed as her parents argued. Her father's voice was sharp, accusing, while her mother sobbed. And then came the crash, the sound of a chair overturning, followed by silence. Her father had left that night and never returned. Her mother had become withdrawn, distant, until one day Clara was sent to live with relatives. She had never been told the full truth, and she had never dared to ask. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she faced the apparition of her mother. "I didn't know. I was just a child." Her mother nodded slowly. "But the room knew. It kept the memories, waiting for you to return and make peace with them." The glow in the room intensified, and Clara felt a warmth envelop her. The shadows that had haunted her began to recede, their whispers fading into the distance. The apartment seemed to breathe again, its oppressive weight lifting. Her mother's figure began to dissolve, her form turning into soft light. "You're free now, Clara, and so am I." As the last remnants of the apparition faded, the chair stood empty once more. Clara felt an overwhelming sense of release, as though a long-held burden had finally been lifted. She returned to the apartment, her steps steady, her mind clear. The mirror hung straight on the wall, its surface reflecting nothing but her own image. The voices were gone, and for the first time, the room truly felt empty. 3. In the days that followed, Clara began to rebuild her life with a newfound sense of clarity. The apartment, once suffocating with its secrets, felt different now, lighter, as though the shadows had retreated for good. The mirror still hung on the wall, but it no longer drew her gaze with unsettling force. Instead, it reflected a woman who had confronted her past and emerged stronger. The notebook she had found remained untouched on her desk, its pages now silent, the frantic scrawls no longer calling to her. Clara began writing again, her words flowing effortlessly as she chronicled her experiences in the apartment. She wasn't sure if it would be a memoir or a novel, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, she felt truly connected to her craft. She told herself over and over again. One evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the room, she opened the window and let the cool breeze wash over her. She stood there for a moment, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The room was still, peaceful, Yet as she turned to leave, she thought she heard something. A faint, fleeting whisper, almost too soft to catch. "Thank you." Clara paused, her heart steady. She smiled faintly, a warmth spreading through her chest. Perhaps the room was truly empty now, or perhaps it would always hold on to echoes of the past. Either way, she felt no fear. For the first time in her life, she was ready to move forward. As Clara closed the door to the apartment for the last time, she whispered into the quiet, "Goodbye." And for a moment, it felt as though the room whispered back.